Somewhere in the world, a man picks up a phone. It looks ordinary. It isn't. There's no email on it, no web browser, no way to place a normal call. To reach the only feature that matters, he opens what looks like a calculator and types in a code. The screen changes, and now he can send a message that he has been promised no government on earth can read. So he writes freely. He talks about shipments, about routes, about rivals and debts, and sometimes about people he wants gone. He trusts this device with the kind of secrets that could put him away for the rest of his life. There's just one problem. On the other end of that unbreakable encryption sits an analyst at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, reading every word he types. The criminal underworld wasn't hacked. It was handed the wiretap, and it paid cash for the privilege. Around 12,000 devices, more than 100 countries, 27 million messages, copied in secret. This is the story of ANOM and Operation Trojan Shield. The case where law enforcement didn't break into the underworld's phones because it had built them. Every case leaves a trace. To understand how the FBI came to own an encrypted phone company, you first have to understand the world it was selling into. For years, serious organized crime had a hardware problem. Ordinary phones leak, calls can be tapped, texts subpoenaed, a location history pulled from a carrier. So a specialized industry grew up to solve that problem. Companies that sold gutted smartphones, stripped of cameras, microphones, satellite location, and normal messaging, and rebuilt around a single encrypted channel. In the trade, they were simply called crime phones. The biggest of them was a Canadian operation called Phantom Secure. Its founder, Vincent Ramos, took ordinary BlackBerry handsets, tore out everything that could betray a user, and routed encrypted messages through servers in places like Panama and Hong Kong. His customers weren't privacy-conscious lawyers. According to United States prosecutors, they included drug traffickers, among them members of the Sinaloa cartel. At one undercover meeting, Ramos was blunt about what his product was for. He admitted, in effect, that it had been built specifically for the drug trade. In March of 2018, the FBI arrested him. Ramos pleaded guilty to a racketeering conspiracy and was sentenced to 9 years in prison. One of the first times American authorities had convicted the head of an encryption company for knowingly serving criminals. And that arrest created a vacuum. Tens of thousands of criminals around the world suddenly held a device they could no longer trust, and no obvious replacement. In any market, when the biggest supplier collapses, someone rushes to fill the gap. The FBI was about to make sure that someone was them. The opportunity walked in through a side door. Around the time Phantom Secure fell, the FBI's field office in San Diego was approached by a confidential source, a man who had himself sold encrypted phones, including Phantom and a rival brand. He was facing serious legal trouble of his own, but he was also holding something valuable. He had been quietly developing his own next-generation encrypted device, a slicker successor to the phones the government had just dismantled. In court records, this source is known only by a codename, Afgoo. His real identity has never been made public. Afgoo offered the FBI a deal. He would hand over his new device and, just as importantly, his contacts inside the criminal networks that would want it, in exchange for a lighter sentence and payment. Reporting on the case indicates the FBI paid him around $120,000 plus expenses. And here the investigators landed on an idea that turned decades of law enforcement thinking on its head. For years, agencies had tried to break into encrypted platforms from the outside. To crack the math or hack the servers, it was slow, expensive, and legally fragile. But what if you didn't have to break in at all? What if the phone belonged to you from the very first day it shipped? What if the encryption worked perfectly? Because you quietly held a copy of every key, they wouldn't hack the underworld's phone. They would become the company that sold it. The device would be called ANOM. Before a single ANOM phone reached a criminal's hand, its betrayal was already built in. Working with a partner overseas, the Australian Federal Police, the FBI helped design the system around a hidden feature. Every ANOM message would be encrypted, exactly as promised. But attached to each one was a secret master key. and a silent instruction. Quietly send a copy of this message, unlocked, to somewhere the user would never see. The phones themselves were convincing. They were built on ordinary handsets, running a custom operating system with the normal functions torn out. No calls, no browsing, no email. To open the messaging app, a user tapped what looked like a plain calculator and entered a code. Inside were the features criminals wanted. Messages that deleted themselves, a panic wipe if the phone was seized, a scrambled PIN screen so nobody could shoulder surf the code. An ANOM phone could only talk to another ANOM phone. You couldn't buy one in a store. You could only get one the way you got everything else in that world, from someone you already trusted for around $2,000, plus a subscription. That last detail was the quiet genius of it, because these phones spread person to person through vouching and reputation. Every new user was effectively pre-screened by criminals themselves. The network would fill up with exactly the people law enforcement most wanted to hear. By late 2018, the first small batch, around 50 devices, went out to a handful of trusted distributors in Australia. A beta test. The trap was baited. Now the FBI needed the Underworld to take it. And to do that, they needed a salesman. They found one who didn't even know he was working for them. Here is what an ANOM user believed was happening when they hit send. Their message was encrypted on their device, traveled as unreadable code, and was unlocked only on the phone of the person they were writing to. On paper, that is genuinely secure. Here is what actually happened. At the moment of sending, the software made a second, silent copy of the message. That copy was carried away to a set of servers the FBI called iBots, routed through intermediaries so users could never trace where it went. There, the message was stripped of its disguise, decrypted, and made readable. The FBI hadn't defeated the encryption. It simply held a key to a lock it had installed itself. But there was a legal problem, and how the FBI solved it is one of the most important and least understood parts of this story. Under United States law, the FBI could not simply sit in America and read the contents of these messages as they streamed in, especially any involving people on American soil. So the operation was engineered around that limit. The bulk of the message traffic was routed to a server in a third country, a nation that obtained its own court order authorizing the interception, and then handed the decrypted messages to the FBI on a regular schedule. For years, that country's identity was a closely held secret. Officials would only ever call it the third country. Later, the journalist Joseph Cox reported that it was Lithuania. No government has ever officially confirmed that, but it meant that while the world thought of ANOM as a purely American operation, the actual reading of many of those messages happened, lawfully, somewhere else entirely. A honeypot is only as good as the people who fall into it. ANOM needed to spread, not to random buyers, but deep into the most serious criminal networks on Earth. For that, the FBI needed a kind of credibility it could never manufacture itself. So it borrowed someone else's. His name was Hakan Ayik. An Australian fugitive of Turkish heritage, Ayik had fled his home country years earlier and built himself into a major figure in the global drug trade. The press had nicknamed him the Facebook gangster for his taste in flaunting a lavish life online. Australian intelligence linked him to a syndicate that authorities estimated was moving well over $1 billion of drugs into the country every year, a figure investigators themselves described as an estimate. Ayik was exactly the kind of connected, trusted operator whose word carried weight. So through an undercover contact, the platform was steered toward him, and Ayik, believing ANOM was the safest phone money could buy, did something the FBI could never have paid for. He recommended it, enthusiastically, to his network. In the underworld, a recommendation from a man like Hakan Ayik was as good as a guarantee. Australian police would later call him, without irony, the platform's single greatest promoter. He sold the FBI's wiretap to his own associates, one handshake at a time, and never knew it. The network began to grow, hundreds of users, then more. And then two events on the other side of the world turned that growth into a flood. And then the FBI got lucky, twice. To understand why, you have to separate three names that are constantly and wrongly told as the same story: EncroChat, Sky ECC, and ANOM. They were different platforms, taken down in different ways, by different people. Getting this distinction right is the whole point. EncroChat was a European encrypted phone network, hugely popular with organized crime across the continent. In 2020, French investigators did something the ANOM team never had to. They broke in from the outside, planting specialized software onto the devices themselves and harvesting messages straight off the handsets. EncroChat was a genuine hack of a company that law enforcement did not control. Sky ECC was another encrypted network and one of the largest in the world. In early 2021, Belgian and Dutch authorities, with French help, penetrated it too, this time by compromising the flow of messages through its infrastructure. Again, an outside operation against a company the police did not own. ANOM was neither of those. ANOM was built and secretly owned by law enforcement from its very first day. There was nothing to hack because the trap was the product. Now here's why those other two takedowns mattered so much. When EncroChat went down, and then Sky, hundreds of thousands of criminals were suddenly, terrifyingly exposed. They panicked. They went hunting for a new safe device, one that hadn't been compromised. And waiting for them, with a glowing recommendation already circulating, was ANOM. The two operations that looked like ANOM's rivals became its recruitment drivers. Users poured in. At its peak, ANOM was running on nearly 12,000 devices in more than 100 countries. By now, agents across multiple countries were doing something almost surreal. They were reading the private, unguarded conversations of organized crime in something close to real time. And these were not vague hints. Users, utterly convinced they were safe, photographed cocaine shipments and sent them like holiday snapshots. They discussed hiding narcotics inside canned goods, inside industrial machinery, inside shipping containers. They negotiated ton-scale deals in plain language. Investigators would eventually catalog more than 27 million messages. But the drugs were not the hardest part, because sometimes an agent watching the feed would see something far more urgent scroll past: a plan to kill someone. This created an agonizing tension at the heart of the operation. Every time investigators moved to save a life, they risked tipping off the network that the phones weren't safe. And every time they held back to protect the secret, the moral weight grew heavier. Authorities say they threaded that needle again and again. The FBI would later describe more than 100 threats to life disrupted. In Sweden, police said they headed off more than 10 planned killings. In Australia, the federal police said the operation prevented 21 murders, including, in one case, a plot against an entire family. Those numbers come from the agencies themselves and are difficult to verify independently. But the underlying reality is not really in dispute. For nearly 3 years, the people planning some of the world's most serious crimes were writing their intentions down inside an app that copied every word to the police. No secret this large stays buried forever. And in the spring of 2021, the operation nearly came apart. In March, an anonymous blog post appeared online. Its author claimed to have examined ANOM closely and concluded it was not what it seemed. The post argued that the app's design and its hidden connections pointed to surveillance, possibly by Western intelligence. In plain terms, this thing is a trap. For the investigators reading along, it was a heart-stopping moment. One well-shared warning, taken seriously by the right people, could empty the network overnight. But it didn't. The post drifted past, doubted or ignored by most of the users who mattered. The machine kept running. Still, the clock was already ticking, and not because of the blog. Remember the third country and its court order. That authorization had an expiry date. The legal permission that made the entire operation possible was set to run out in June of 2021. So the investigators faced a choice: quietly wind the whole thing down, or use the deadline to go out with the largest coordinated strike in the history of organized crime enforcement. They chose the strike. And across 16 countries, thousands of officers began, very quietly, to prepare. On the 7th and 8th of June 2021, it happened all at once. In coordinated raids around the globe, an estimated 9,000 law enforcement officers moved at the same time. Doors came off their hinges from Australia to Germany to the Netherlands to Scandinavia. In a single sweep, more than 800 people were arrested across 16 countries. Investigators carried out hundreds of searches, targeting more than 300 criminal syndicates. The haul was staggering: more than 8 tons of cocaine, 22 tons of cannabis, 2 tons of methamphetamine, 250 firearms, 55 luxury vehicles, and more than $48 million in cash and cryptocurrency. Then came the part designed for maximum effect. Instead of quietly logging the arrests, law enforcement held simultaneous press conferences and revealed the twist to the world, and, more pointedly, to every criminal still holding a phone. In the United States, an official put it plainly: the devices, he said, had actually been operated by the FBI. In The Hague, the Bureau called the results staggering. In Australia, the Prime Minister called it a watershed moment. For the Underworld, the message was devastating in a way no single arrest could ever be. It wasn't just that hundreds had been caught, it was that the ground beneath them was gone. If ANOM had been the FBI all along, then what else was compromised? Who else was an informant? Which device could anyone trust now? Overnight, a criminal economy built on the promise of secure communication was told that its most trusted tool had been a government microphone. The operation left 2 men in very different and very strange positions. The first was Hakan Ayik, the unwitting salesman. In one stroke, the man who had recommended ANOM to half the underworld was exposed as the person who had led them all into the trap. He had done it innocently, but that distinction offered him little protection. Australian police took the unusual step of publicly urging him to turn himself in, for his own safety, warning that the people he'd unknowingly betrayed might come looking. Reporting indicates Ayik was later arrested in Turkey. The second man simply vanished. Afgoo, the source who had handed the FBI its phone company and its way in, disappeared into protection. Because every distributor extradited to the United States eventually pleaded guilty, there was never a full trial. And so the one proceeding that might have forced Afgoo's real name into the open never happened. To this day, the identity of the man at the center of the largest sting of its kind remains a secret. The trap had closed, but a harder question was only beginning. Had any of it been legal? An operation this audacious was always going to be fought in the courtroom, and it was on 2 continents at once. In the United States, defense lawyers moved to throw out the ANOM evidence, arguing the sweeping, warrantless collection had violated their clients' rights. The court disagreed. It concluded that the constitutional protections they invoked did not extend to the foreign nationals charged in the case, and that the way the data had been gathered did not break American law. The evidence stood. One by one, the extradited defendants pleaded guilty. In Australia, the fight was even sharper, and it climbed all the way to the top. The core argument was technical, but profound, that copying the messages amounted to intercepting private communications, which should have required a specific kind of warrant the police never obtained. Lower courts sided with the police. Then the country's parliament passed a law confirming the material had been lawfully collected. A retrospective fix that critics warned set an uncomfortable precedent. In 2025, Australia's highest court upheld that law, and with it, the admissibility of the ANOM evidence. And that is the uneasy question the operation leaves behind. Almost no one mourns the traffickers it caught, but Operation Trojan Shield also means this. For 3 years, a government ran a communications company, sold it to thousands of people, and read everything they wrote, with the most sensitive legal step quietly handled by another country. Supporters call it the most effective single idea in the modern history of policing. Critics call it a blueprint, one that should unsettle anyone, because the same architecture that catches a cartel could, in other hands, be pointed anywhere. Both things can be true at once. In the end, the underworld was undone by the very thing it wanted most. It craved perfect secrecy, a single trusted place to speak freely, beyond the reach of the state. And the harder it searched for that place, the more it gathered, all together, inside one network. It just happened that the network belonged to the FBI. The trace was there from the very first message, not because investigators found it, because they wrote the software that left it. If you want more forensic breakdowns of the cases that shape the digital underworld, subscribe and stay with us. Every case leaves a trace,